Good evening, class. I apologize for being late on getting these two lectures up to you. Tonight I'm going to lecture on the late Middle Ages. We're going to talk about the transition from the medieval era in European history to the early modern era. Because just like all eras in history, the Middle Ages had to come to an end. And by tomorrow afternoon, I will complete the lecture on European exploration, the Columbian period. We'll be talking about Christopher Columbus, talking about his competitors, people like Diaz and da Gama, and how this period of European exploration would lead to the discovery of the rest of the world, conquest of large portions of that new world, namely here in the Western Hemisphere. But we'll also talk about why Europeans began to explore the world when they did. Why did Columbus set off when he did? We'll talk about that. But tonight, let's get to talking about the late Middle Ages. Now, if the bookends for the two periods that we've talked about so far when we're talking about medieval Europe, the early Middle Ages and the high Middle Ages, are the fall of Rome in the mid to late 400s, being the forward bookend of the early Middle Ages, and 1066, or around the 1000s, being the separation point between the early and high Middle Ages. What is the event that signifies the end of the high Middle Ages and the beginning of the late Middle Ages, this period of decline in the feudal system? I'm waiting for you guys to answer that for yourself. So should have been reading this in class, or either reading this in your book. We'll be talking about this in class. It's a major event. It's a groundbreaking event. And this event, of course, is the Black Death. The plague, or bubonic plague. Now, bubonic plague didn't just hit Europe when it did in the mid-1300s. It first gets to Europe around 1346, 1347. But like all good pandemics, there is a precursor to the mass die-off of people in Europe. And it has to do with farming technology and bad weather. Europeans were still farming in a similar manner and with similar technology that they had been throughout the Middle Ages, early and high. Wooden plows. Now, we take farming for granted. We take the fact that we have steel hand implements like a hoe that can break up red clay mud. Most of the tools available to farmers and peasants in the Middle Ages were still made of wood, even the blades. So your wooden plow could only plow and lay off sandy or loamy soil. You couldn't use a wooden plow around here in East Tennessee. The red clay mud, it would bog up. You need an iron or preferably a steel plow. So a lot of the land in Europe was marginal in terms of its ability to be cultivated. On top of this, there were a sequence of years prior to the 1340s where Europe experienced both harsh winters, cold temperatures, and dry, drought-filled summers. So the European population, which had grown considerably over the course of the Middle Ages, was undernourished, underfed. And of course, undernourished peoples tend to be more vulnerable to diseases. And into this environment where you have an undernourished, weakened population, a population that is, by today's standards, a dirty population, because in the Middle Ages, people first did not have the ability for the levels of personal hygiene that we have today. but also the cultural norms of the era told people to be dirty. People wanted to be dirty because from just their basic experience, if you fell in the river, you came down with a cold. If you took a bath, which normally was in cold water, you might get a disease that would kill you. So Europeans, just from their own experience, equated being dirty and filthy with being healthy. And as this population grew, it was not only putting a strain on the agricultural system of Europe, but imagine the human waste, the excrement, the piss that literally flowed through the mud streets of many peasant villages and early towns. Europe was not a clean place in the Middle Ages. And so in the 1340s, bubonic plague makes its way to Europe. Now, bubonic plague has its origins in China. Your book actually does a pretty good job talking about its origins, talking about how it had laid waste to Chinese cities as it marched across what is today China, Tibet, through the Middle East, and then finally was carried via the trade routes, these trade routes that had been revitalized by the Crusades. It had traveled through these trade routes to Europe. Now, a map in your textbook on page 310 shows something similar to this. You see here how the plague first shows up around 1347 here in Constantinople, in southern Italy, places like Rome, Genoa, but also southern France. Of course, these are the port cities. Constantinople is a trading port city, so is Naples, Genoa, Marseille. All of these areas are where ships coming from the Near East, this area right here, are landing and putting forth onto the docks their goods and wares that they have bought from these areas. And of course, riding on these ships are stowaways, rats. And on the rats are more stowaways, fleas. And the rats are infected with plague, and the fleas bite the rats. And when the rats get close to humans, especially when the rat dies, the fleas go looking for another host. Of course, they land on humans, bite them, and give them the plague. Now, what is the plague? What is bubonic plague? Well, it gets its name from the boibles. These, well, to put it bluntly, they look like big, blood-filled bruises, sometimes even swelling into pustules. But that's the very last stage of the Black Death. Bubonic plague, when you're infected with it, first affects your internal organs. These boibles, these blood-filled sores, actually show up on your internal organs first, in your lungs, on your liver. You know you have plague when you start to run a high fever, basically flu-like symptoms, except you're coughing up blood. And then finally, you start to get these blood-red lesions on your skin. And of course, as the blood cankers up and gets old, it turns black. Hence the name Black Death, because by the time these sores are turned black, you have days at best to live. You're guaranteed that you're about to wind up 6 feet under. Now, the bubonic plague is one of these diseases that has a long incubation period. So if we go back to the map here, one of the reasons why it is able to, sweep through Europe is as these merchants who are dealing with the sailors and seafaring merchants of Europe buy wares and start to transport them themselves, traveling salesmen, if you will, from these port cities to the rest of Europe. they're taking the plague with them, either with the fleas that are on them or inside their own bodies. And as the plague starts to break out in southern Europe, people in these areas start to flee. Many of them are already infected. So in many ways, the pandemic is self-replicating, because the people that actually flee it are the people who are the carriers. And they may not be showing signs of the sickness while they're the carriers, but within a few days or a week or so, they come down with the symptoms and they relatively quickly die. Now, this is a society that has no medical technology and medical knowledge to combat the Black Death. To put it bluntly, Europeans are at the mercy of the disease, the mercy of fate. Are they going to be bitten by a flea or not? And so the Black Death is devastating, and in a population that is somewhere between 400 and 500 million people, the Black Death is estimated to have killed a third of them in just under 5 years. I mean, think about this. Having over 100 million people dead, about between 150 to 180 people die. In some areas of Europe, the death rate is far greater than that in terms of percentage of the population. It devastates areas of Europe. Now, the Europeans don't have our medical knowledge. They don't know that bubonic plague is a disease that is spread through rats and fleas. They blame it on the devil. They blame it on sin. They blame it on, well, they blame it on alien elements inside their society, because the responses that Europeans have are threefold. The first, Europeans turn to the church. They turn to the church for help against this curse from Satan, or the wrath of God, as many of them see it. However, the church is just as ill prepared to combat this disease as the secular authorities. And so this is the interesting thing that you need to remember to understand the effect of the plague. It shows to many Europeans that the church has limitations, that the church is not all-powerful. And as a result, many Europeans first turn to the church, and when the church fails them, they don't abandon God. Instead, they turn to God themselves. This is one of the preconditions necessary for Protestantism, because Protestantism is the belief in many Protestant denominations that people have the ability to talk to God directly without the need for a priest, without the need for the church. Now, Europeans also attack alien communities within their society, most notably the Jews of Europe. Now, the Jews of Europe are, well, let's just put it this way, an easy target. They're not Christians, and many Europeans feel that they are in league with Satan, or they're heretics or infidels. They're not part of the church body. Also, the Jews tend to live in urban areas. They have been, for the most part in Western Europe, denied the right to farm. And so the Jews have moved into the towns. We'll talk about the towns here in a minute. And have taken up trades. They are craftsmen, like goldsmiths. They have taken up the jobs of being merchants. And living in the towns, they are initially less exposed to the Black Death. They're a cleaner population living in the towns. And so they're less likely to get it initially. And as your book shows, if you turn to page, let's see here, 309, there's some primary sources talking about where people believed the plague came from. And the very last one is from a fellow by the name of Hermann Gigas, talking about well poisoning. And the group most likely blamed for well poisoning are the Jews. And so in many of areas of Europe, you see secular authorities expelling the Jews, telling them to get out, leave, or die. In other areas of Europe, most notably in Eastern Europe, secular authorities hold what are known as pogroms. These are basically organized raids against Jewish communities to break them up, to force the Jews out, or to kill them. Now finally, the most interesting response is, well, first it's counterproductive, and to us in today's society it almost sounds comedic. At this time, Europeans still believed that you had witches, that you had human beings who worked with or worked for Satan himself. Now these witches had familiars. It being close to Halloween, we're going to see witches with their cats. A cat is a familiar. Now the reason why they believed in familiars is a familiar is the demon, the evil spirit that is embodied in an animal form that superstitious Europeans at this time believed gave the witches their power. So Europeans literally start hunting down and killing all the cats of Europe. Can you imagine? Here, kitty, 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 kitty. Here, kitty. Because not only does this sound stupid to us, it's counterproductive, because what is the animal most likely to hunt and kill the rats that carry the fleas, that carry the plague? The cats. And so with the elimination of the cat population of Europe, the rat population explodes, thus making the plague even worse. Now, what are some effects besides just population decrease? Well, the immediate effect of losing 1/3 of the population is going to have immediate effects, but it's also going to have delayed long-term effects. The immediate effect is that the people most hurt, most affected by this population decline, which are the poor, the peasants, these are the people who provide labor in this society. So if you decrease the labor supply, what happens to the cost of that labor supply? In a way, the plague actually empowers, to some degree, the peasant worker. Because now, since there are fewer peasants, they can ask more. They can demand higher wages. And so during the late Middle Ages, after the plague, you see a series of revolts by peasants and town laborers demanding higher wages, as the nobility and the secular authorities try and pass laws to decrease wages. Now, the long-term effect of this decrease in population and this battle over wages is that nobles will decide that the old feudal model of having peasants doesn't work. They need to get the labor without the responsibilities. They don't want to have to take care of children. They don't want to have to provide for elderly peasants in the old serf system. They just want people to work for them for a wage, and when they get too old to work for them or are unproductive, they want to be able to fire them. And so one of the long-term effects of first the plague and then this battle over wages is the destruction of the feudal economic model, and in its place, the model where people literally work for pay. And this first shows up in agriculture, wage labor. Now, on the one hand, this sounds terrible because, oh Lord, people are working for wages, and once they're unproductive, they can be fired. But in another way, wage labor is liberating, because when Europeans transitioned to wage labor beginning in the 14 and 1500s, it means that Europeans aren't tied to the land. They don't have to listen to a lord because they can quit. They can go and find work other places. They can compete not just within the confines of the landlord that they used to serve, but now they can travel and seek out a better deal. Now, the reason why I'm pointing this out is what is developing while the plague is going on and continuing after the plague's final decline in the 1350s and 1360s is a transition in European society. A transition mainly that has to do with economics. Because in the late High Middle Ages, so right before the plague, you start to see the rise of the town. Towns are different from villages. A village, by definition, is tied to that feudal manor. The village is concerned and concentrates mainly on agricultural production. A town, the reason why you have village and town, a town is, well, it has to do with commerce. It has to do with trade and manufacturing. It is not concerned, it is not dedicated around agricultural production. Now, some of the first towns are actually chartered by local landlords because of the revitalization of the trade routes due to the Crusades. Local nobles realize that increased trade could benefit them if it comes through their territory. So what they do is they invite merchants and craftsmen to literally found communities on land given to them by a local landlord. These are so-called chartered towns. Others, these towns are initially known as communes. They're just founded organically by merchants and craftsmen. Now, who lives in these towns? Well, I just mentioned them. Merchants and craftsmen. Now, one of the most important ones is, of course, the merchant. Why are merchants important to this transition away from a feudal economy to what I call a cash economy? Well, first and foremost, merchants do not deal in land. Land is not the medium of exchange in the merchant's life. They may buy and sell land, but it's not what they actually use as a means of exchange. And what do I mean by means of exchange? Means of exchange. Money. We have a means of exchange today, at least for right now, until all of the mistakes made by our various government leaders screw up our currency. It's called the dollar. It really has no value. It's paper. However, it is a medium of exchange that for right now most people accept. In this time period of the 13 and 1400s, merchants deal in cash as well. This time it's mainly gold or silver coins, money that actually had an intrinsic value. Now, why is this transition to a cash economy important? Because the merchants will be the new economic power class. They will supersede the old landed nobility as the economic powerhouses of Europe. Because as these trade routes expand, as they revitalize, as products and goods flow throughout Europe, these merchants will become incredibly wealthy. And one way they become wealthy is they're selling to the old noble class. And of course, the noble class, where is their wealth locked up in? Do they have a lot of cash? Do they have a big bank account? No, they don't. Their land is locked, or their wealth is locked up in land. So there's the irony of the late Middle Ages. While the nobility is still the political center of power, the economic center of power is switching very quickly to the merchant class, because the nobles have to go into debt to the merchants in order to buy goods that the merchants offer. Now, you might be asking, well, why doesn't the nobility just take it? Well, that would be counterproductive. because the nobles find out very quickly that if they try and just take the merchant's goods, they won't be able to trade with that merchant, but they won't be able to trade with other merchants as well, because news will get out about the practices of these nobles. And so they will be locked out of trade. And as this trade is revitalized, the nobles desperately want to get involved in this. So the power of the merchants, this economic power, the control of the trade, the control of commerce, translates to social and political power. They have influence over the nobles. Likewise, the craftsmen start to show their power, especially those craftsmen that are living in these new towns and cities, because they don't control the trade, but they control the craft. Because much of the trade that the merchants are dealing in are manufactured goods. Coopers, shoemakers, clockmakers. The merchants need these goods. And one way that craftsmen keep their power and guard their power is they come together in something that is sort of similar to a modern day union. These are called guilds. Now, how does a guild work? Well, in the guild system, there is hierarchy within a craft. So within, say, the masons, brick masons, stone masons, you'll have a master mason. This person is a person who has mastered all the elements of building homes, structures, castles, cathedrals. They know how to make arches. They know how to support structures. They know how to make domed ceilings. All with stone. They know the secret of something we take for granted today, concrete. Working under them are men that know most of that information as well. However, they worked for the master. These are known as journeymen. And then under the journeymen are the entry-level people, the people that are normally teenagers that have come to the master and have asked, "Can I work for you? Will you teach me the craft?" And these are the apprentices. And of course, the apprentices can be elevated to journeymen by their master. However, a single master cannot make one of their journeymen another master. To become a master, if you're a journeyman, not only do you have to have the consent of your master, but you have to have the consent of the majority of the other masters in the guild of the craft. So all the other stonemasons have to recognize you as a master mason. Now, of course, some of you might be saying that this sounds kind of familiar. This sounds like something that the Freemasons do. Well, Freemasonry, like the Shriners or the local Masons Lodge, the reason why they're called this and why their symbol is the square, let's see here, I forget what the other tool is, the compass and square, is those are the tools of the Mason. That is the Masons Lodge of the stone and brick masons. And of course, the craftsman, the master craftsman, can influence and express his power through control of the craft. Because if I am, say, the French king, and I want to have Notre Dame built, this grand cathedral in Paris, I can hire a master stonemason. But what happens if I go to that stonemason and say, "Oh, halfway through the job, I'm going to only pay you half as much as what I originally agreed upon"? Well, that master mason will tell all of his journeymen and apprentices, "We're going home. We're not going to finish the job." And guess what? When you go to another stonemason, I'm going to already tell everybody around here who works in the craft, and if they're part of the guild, and almost everybody in the craft is going to be in the guild because that gives you this protection, they're not going to work for you either. If they are, they're going to ask you an astronomically high price. And of course, this will force you to either pay a higher price or come back to me. And of course, am I going to work for the same amount that the French king demands? No, I'm not. I'm going to ask more. And we see the growing power of the townfolk, if you will, of the craftsmen and the merchants, in the example of the Hanseatic League. Now, the Hanseatic League, going back to the map here, existed from about Antwerp here in the west over to Danzig in the east. It included major cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Lübeck, but also Berlin, Cologne, and other cities here in what is today Denmark and as far north as Scandinavia. Now, the Hanseatic League starts out as independent towns. These are towns that are independent of any noble lord. Their government is more reflective of what we think of a city government, where you have a town council that is elected by the male population. Now, because these wealthy towns have the financial means to protect themselves by hiring mercenaries, they're able to defend themselves against the nobles around them, to secure their place there on the coast. But they go farther than that. They actually enter into mutual defense agreements with other of these independent towns, thus forming the Hanseatic League. If you were a league member and you were attacked by a local lord, you could request aid in the form of money, but also the militias, the defenders of other cities coming to your aid. And the Hanseatic League, which gets its start in the mid-1300s, will reach its zenith in the mid to late 1400s and be incredibly powerful and incredibly influential. We also see the power of this cash economy and this urban economy when we look at Dante and Geoffrey Chaucer. If you guys have read Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales or Dante's Inferno, you may not have noticed this, but you can see that respect for and the authority of the traditional authorities of the Middle Ages, namely the nobility and the church, is starting to break down. Because let's look at Chaucer. Chaucer, in the Knight's Tale, the Lady's Tale, the Bishop's Tale, the various chapters of the Canterbury Tales, is talking about all of these classic characters of medieval society. People that should be held up with esteem, like a knight, like a lady of the court, like a church official. However, Chaucer's making fun of them. He's ridiculing the society in which he lives. Likewise, Dante, in painting a picture of hell, he basically says there are 9 levels of hell. And the 7th, 8th, and 9th levels, guess who's there? Is it your common thief? Is it your murderer? No. These levels of hell, the worst levels of hell, are reserved for nobles, for church officials, for popes. People that the church and the nobility say would never be in hell because they're nobles and because they're good churchmen, they're good clergy. Dante says, no, they're in hell. And the reason why Dante and Chaucer are able to get away with this is the consumers of their literature are not, for the most part, the clergy and the old nobility. Increasingly, their clientele, the people reading their works, are the new, educated, and economically empowered craft and merchant classes. The late Middle Ages can best be characterized as a time period where not only secular authority is on the rise, but Europeans view of the church starts to change. The late Middle Ages is a time period where the omnipotent power of the church is called into question, and there are reasons why. First, the failure of the church to do anything about the plague, and then during this time period, the church itself appears to start to fall apart. This is known as the Second Great Schism. Now, if you remember, the first schism was in 1054, and it was when the Catholic and Orthodox Church split from each other. The second schism, otherwise known as the Western Schism, occurs between 1309 and 1417. It starts in 1309 when Philip IV of France comes into conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. Philip IV argues that he has the right to administer and tax church lands in France to raise revenue. Of course, the leader of the Catholic Church, Pope Boniface, argues that no, the church is exempt. Boniface goes as far as threatening to excommunicate Philip IV. But unlike Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire back in 1075, Philip in 1309 is not dependent on the old feudal oaths for support. He has instituted a central administration where he is receiving tax money, and then he's using that tax money to hire a military force. So his army is loyal to him because he's the one that signs their paychecks. And so Philip is able to send them into northern Italy, where Pope Boniface is vacationing, break in and arrest him. They beat him up and bring him back to Paris, where he dies. Of course, this means that the Catholic Church needs a new pope. And so in 1309, the College of Cardinals, the second most powerful men in the Catholic Church underneath the Pope, meet in Rome to choose a new pope. Now, at this time, many of these cardinals are either French or pro-French. So they elect a French pope, Clement V. And Clement V moves the papacy, the residency of the pope, from Rome to Avignon, France. Avignon, France is approximately right about here, right about where the X in Bordeaux is. Now, let me just ask you this simple question. It's pretty obvious. With the Pope living right here, with the Pope living right here, that means that they're awfully close to the power and influence of the French court. And of course, today, Catholic officials call this the period of the Babylonian captivity, hearkening back to the time in which the Jews were forced into exile by the Babylonians. But at this time, Clement is the recognized pope. And from 1710, or not 1710, 1310, getting dates mixed up, sorry. From 1310 until 1378, the French popes are the singular head of the Catholic Church. However, this changes with the death of Gregory XI. Because after Gregory XI dies in 1378, the College of Cardinals meets again in Rome. However, the Roman citizens are rioting. They're demanding that the next pope cannot be another sympathetic to the French pope. There has to be a Roman pope. So they elect a Roman pope, Urban VI. However, most of the cardinals are still sympathetic and pro-French. And so they meet just a few days later and elect another pro-French pope, Clement VII. Now imagine this. I guess they expected Urban VI to step down, but he doesn't. And so you have a Roman pope and a French pope. The Roman pope, of course, resides in Rome. Clement VII resides in Avignon. And so you have the French Pope and you have the Roman Pope. Each of these popes considers the other to be an illegitimate, quote, anti-pope. They excommunicate each other when they when the other one refuses to step down. And so from 1378 up until the early 1400s, you have two popes, and it's not just a division in the church of those that support the Avignon Pope versus the Roman Pope. It is a political division of Europe because France and its allies support the Avignon Pope. Opponents of France support the Roman Pope. And so church officials fear that this could be another schism like what happened in 1054. So starting in the late 1300s and early 1400s, church officials start to call for conciliation, to bring the church back together. In 1409, they call a council at Pisa, Italy, where the Leaning Tower of Pisa is located at. Excuse me. There, they elect a new pope, Alexander V. However, the successors to Urban VI and Clement VII, in this case it's Benedict the 13th and Innocent the 7th. These two successors to the French Pope and the original Roman Pope refused to step down. So in 1409 you now have not two popes, you got three. So this goes on until 1414, where you have three popes vying for power. In 1414, church officials called the Council of Constance. This time they learned from their mistake at Pisa. The first thing that they do is they issue a statement stating that all the previous popes are illegitimate anti-popes, that if they do not step down, that the College of Cardinals will excommunicate them. And what they do is they name another pope. Now, with the Council of Constance, you have a healing of the church as an institution. But the divisions, both within the church itself and Europe in terms of its political situation, will persist beyond 1417. One thing that is interesting is that while the two Roman popes will step down after the Council of Constance to be replaced by the Council of Constance Pope, the French Pope will not. And for a short period of time, you will have a French illegitimate anti-pope that continues on claiming to be the real pope after the Council of Constance. But even after the French popes disappear into history, the main problem for the Catholic Church is that during the time period of two popes and then three popes, these popes had supporters within the church. They also had different policy initiatives. They wanted to take the church in different directions. So even though the church as an institution, a governing body, is brought back together, those dogmatic differences on what Catholic Christianity actually is are not healed with the Council of Constance. There what will be a split after the Council of Constance. And the Council of Constance caused, or will cause, as we will see in class, the Reformation in Europe starting in the late 1400s. But we'll get to that in another lecture. Now finally, there's another major event that is going on, that is coinciding with the Black Death, with the Second Great Schism. And this is the 100 Years' War. Now the 100 Years' War is a complex issue but it will set the stage for France and England being two unified but at odds powers. It is this competition between England and France which will really define the 16 and 1700s. And it really gets its start here in the late Middle Ages. Now, before we get started with this slide, I need to kind of give you some background that we've already went over in class, but to refresh your memory. If you guys remember, in 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England, defeated Harold II, and became not only King of England, but retained his title of Duke of Normandy. And so, from that period on, the English kings have been part of the French court as well. And this has caused problems. If you remember from a previous lecture, Henry II and then later on Richard the Lionhearted and Prince John would wage war against Philip II of France because they refused to act as a vassal, to give homage to the French king, and actually fought to put themselves in the place of the French king. And during this time period of Philip II, the French or the English king will lose Normandy and be forced to the small territory of Gascony, which is down in the southwestern corner of France. And there, the English monarchs will remain, again, nobles of France, the Duke of Gascony. Now, in 1328, there is a dynastic issue in France, a dynastic question, because Charles IV, King of France, dies without a male heir. Now, without going into the genealogy of the French kings, what I can tell you is the nearest male heir is none other than Edward III of England. He is also Duke of Gascony. And so Edward III argues that he should be the next French king. However, French nobles refuse to make the English king the French king. Instead, they choose Philip, Charles IV's cousin. And so Philip V is not the next nearest kin like Edward III. So Edward III, from 1328 to 1337, refuses to pay homage to the new French king. He refuses to listen to him. He refuses to collect taxes. He basically runs his territory in France as if it's independent of the French monarch. And this causes Philip, the French king, to declare war on Edward III. In response, Edward III declares war on Philip. Now, early on, well, to put it bluntly, the English actually dominate the French. The first phase of the war, which lasts between 1337, and 1360, is a time period in which the French lose some major battles. The Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Sluys, which is a naval battle. At the Battle of Sluys, the French Navy is basically annihilated, and at the Battle of Crécy, the French army is decimated. Now, the first phase after the Battle of Crécy and Sluys ends in a peace that lasts between 1360 and 1369. During this time period, the French kings are literally held captive by the English monarchs. And so you have this time period where the French are basically at the behest of the English. But the English can't capitalize on this, because during this time period of peace, the English monarch, Edward III, is old and is growing ill. He will die during this time period. But his son, Edward the Black Prince, is also ill. So the opening phase of the second phase of the 100 Years' War is actually a time period where the French have the advantage, because after Charles V comes to power, Charles V is the son of Charles IV, Philip, who is held in captivity. When Charles V comes to the throne of France, he is able to rally France, rally the forces of France, and actually turn back some of the gains of the English. And so this second phase, which lasts between 1369 and 1389, is a time period where the French actually make up for some of the losses that they had during the first phase. And then you have a period of peace between 1389 and 1415. Now, during this time period, Charles V will die, and his son, Charles VI, will take over. And Charles VI, near the end of this period of peace, will start to go mad. He'll start to lose his mind. And this will open the doorway for, again, the English to advance on France. Because during the second phase and during the second peace, the English were having to deal with their own dynastic problems at home. But by 1415, Henry V has assumed the throne of England. Now, Henry V is one of the more famous and strong monarchs of England. Now, Henry V is related, again, he is related to the French crown. In 1420, he negotiates a treaty with the now crazy Charles VI. Under what is known as the Treaty of Troyes, Troyes, Henry V will marry Charles VI's daughter and become King of France, while Charles VI disowns his own son, Charles VII, or the Dauphin. In France, the princes are known as the Dauphin. So the Dauphin Charles is literally told by his father that he's a bastard, he's illegitimate, and that the legitimate heir is the husband of his sister, which would be Henry V. And so this opens the last and third phase of the 100 Years' War. And early on in this phase, the French, well, let's put it this way, they get the shit kicked out of them. One of the earliest battles, even before the Treaty of Troyes, is the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. This is a battle that is noted for basically decimating the French nobility, because what happens is the French nobles, the knights, and by 1415, these are the knights clad in armor plate, the knights in shining armor, ride forward onto the field of battle into a hail of arrows fired by English longbowmen. So the first ranks are dehorsed. That's literally what the term is. They're dehorsed from their mounts into a field that had just had rain the night before. So here you are, you're a knight, you're weighing about 100 pounds of armor, you've been hit, you're wounded, you're bleeding, you're basically knocked off into the mud, you have second waves of knights coming back over you, so you have horses stepping on you, and then that second wave is dehorsed, and they're falling on you, so you have a 200-pound man with 100 pounds of armor who's also wounded or maybe even dead falling on top of you. So literally knights are drowning in the mud, and those that don't drown are finished off by English infantrymen. It doesn't look good, because after the Battle of Agincourt and after the Battle of the Treaty of Troyes, many French nobles side with the English crown. The Dauphin is illegitimate. He is facing not only a powerful English force, but problems with pro-English French nobles. How do you rally France to your cause when you have been disowned by your own father? Well, this is where a peasant girl by the name of Joan comes into the picture and basically saves Dauphin Charles. Because according to the historical accounts, the maid, or Joan of Arc, she claims to have had visions given to her by God. These visions tell her to go to Reims, France, because Paris is under the control of the English. She is told to go to Reims, France, where Charles the Dauphin has set up his court, to offer her services and to lead the forces of France against the heretics. Because at this time, this is the time of the Great Schism, to lead the forces against the heretics and free France from the English. Now, we don't know if Joan actually led forces into battle, or if she rode into battle as more of a figurehead while her, quote, subordinates were the actual military commanders. But the importance of Joan of Arc is not her military skill. The importance of Joan of Arc is she becomes a focus point, a rallying point for French patriots. They can't rally around the Dauphin because he's an illegitimate ruler. However, he is able to gain legitimacy because he has the support of Joan of Arc. And so, in this way, Joan of Arc gives Charles VII the legitimacy that he needs. He doesn't get it from his bloodline, but he gets it from Joan of Arc. And since many Frenchmen believe in those visions, by extension, the Dauphin is the rightful king of France because he has been predestined by God through Joan of Arc to be the king of France. And so France rallies. Those French monarchs that had sided with the English, many of them, most of them, changed sides. They can't stand against the popular opinion that is generated by Joan of Arc. And so by the end of the 100 Years' War, 1453, the English are forced out of France. All of France. And so you have this situation that for the first time since 1066, the English are no longer claimants to the French throne. This chronic thorn in the side of the French of having the English king be a vassal of the French king is now gone, and France is unified. And Joan of Arc becomes this symbol of French nationalism. Even today, France looks at Joan of Arc as that unifying figure. Now, another effect of the war, besides a unified France, is that this is a war that lasts over 100 years. The old feudal system, where you have nobles administering the land, peasants working the land, this system, while good for a short war or a short defensive fight, is not suited for a long, drawn-out war. Because how do you continue to produce agricultural goods? How do you continue to grow crops if all of these people that, have these feudal oaths with each other have been drawn off to fight a war that's over 100 years long? Well, it goes back to this transition that we talked about not only in this lecture but in the previous lectures, that both England and France are creating centralized kingdoms. They're not relying upon the old feudal system. Instead, they're literally hiring mercenaries. They're hiring people to fight for them. These are known as free companies. They are free in that they sell their services to the highest bidder. Paid soldiers. And so this is one of the effects of the war, is if you're literally changing your entire military structure to be dependent on paid free companies, there is no need for that feudal system. So this is a nail in the coffin of the old feudal system. So if we're looking at the end of the late Middle Ages, the end of the 100 Years' War is one of three events that marks the end of this time period. The other is the fall of Constantinople and Columbus's discovery of America. We'll talk about Columbus's discovery of America in a lecture that I will be uploading tomorrow. But let's talk about the second event that is the bookend for the Middle Ages as a whole. One of the three events that marks the end of the Middle Ages. Now, in the late 1300s, while all of this is going on in Europe, Ottoman Turks, Muslim Turks, invade the Balkans. If you're wondering where the Balkans are, going back to the map here, these are the Balkans. Greece, what is today Serbia and Croatia, this area right in here are the Balkans. Serbia is right here. And in 1389, that little kingdom of Serbia is defeated by the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of Kosovo. This battle effectively seals off Constantinople from the rest of Europe. Constantinople is surrounded at that point. And so the Ottomans first consolidate their territory in the Balkans and in what is today modern-day Turkey, and then lay siege to the Byzantine capital. They finally take it in 1453. The Turkish leader Mehmed I literally rides into Constantinople, walks into the throne room, sits down on the throne, and declares himself to be the new emperor, but not of a Byzantine empire, of an Ottoman empire. And so this area of Europe, which had been the buffer to Muslim encroachments to Europe, is now been conquered. That buffer is gone. That protective barrier is gone. And so, under leaders like Suleiman the Magnificent, Muslim forces will go out from these Balkan strongholds, these captured Balkan territories, and conquer Eastern Europe. They'll actually make it as far as Belgrade and Vienna. Belgrade falls. It fell. But Vienna is saved by a harsh winter. Now, the fighting that goes on in Eastern Europe is historically noted as being very, very brutal. This brutal form of warfare actually gives rise to somebody that you would recognize. This is the character of Dracula. Now, the actual real person that Dracula is based on was not a vampire, but he did let a lot of blood. This was Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Valencia. Vlad was a Christian prince fighting against the Ottoman Turks. And when he defeated the Ottoman Turks on the field of battle, he would take the corpses and the prisoners, the guys that are still alive, and impale them on giant poles, basically stick a wooden telephone pole up their ass, and let the weight of their body carry them down. He became known as Vlad the Impaler. His tactics were so brutal that not only did Suleiman the Magnificent claim him to be a demon, the church, the Orthodox Church, excommunicates him because of his brutal tactics. And he's actually betrayed to the Ottoman Turks by other Christian rulers. And of course, according to the legend, Vlad makes a deal with the devil because he's been excommunicated, and of course takes on supernatural powers. We don't know if that actually happened historically. But what we do know is the tactics of Vlad and men like him illustrate this brutal religious warfare. And one of the interesting things about Vlad today is, today we look at Vlad here in the West and we think, man, this guy was a brutal son of a bitch. However, if you go to Romania today, he is a national hero. They literally think of him the same way we think of George Washington. However, in the end, Vlad was unsuccessful in fending off Muslim encroachments. So we see here that over time, the Ottoman Empire will expand into a powerful empire. They first conquer this area of Europe here in the Anatolia Peninsula in the Holy Land. They'll extend control over North Africa. They will extend control into the Balkans over Greece and Serbia, Valencia, and as far north as modern-day Austria and Ukraine. So the importance of this growing empire is that by the time it reaches its height in the early 1500s, it effectively sits astride those vital trade routes to not only the Near East, but over here off the map, the Far East, China, India, and these places. Places where Europeans want to get goods here, but they don't want to either do business with people they consider to be religious infidels. They don't want to have to pay these people money to get their goods. But there's also this risk that the Muslims, the Ottoman Turks, will cut off those supply lines and deny Western Europe access to these goods. This is one reason why Columbus and other European explorers decide to, well, if we can't capitalize on trade overland or through the Mediterranean here, which this area of the Mediterranean is dominated by the Ottoman Turks, we need to find another way to these valuable and lucrative goods over here. So this, of course, leads to Columbus. So if you're wondering why Columbus started out when he did in 1492, there are several reasons. The first is the fall of Constantinople. The second is the revitalized economy of Europe after the High and Late Middle Ages. And finally, the reason why Columbus sails for Spain is because of the Reconquista. Those Spanish forces led by Aragon and the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile that push the Moors out of Iberia but leave Spain in a weakened state and desiring a quick way of, well, making money. And one way they see this is to corner the market on the trade to the Far East. If they can find a quick way to trade with the Far East, then they will gain wealth literally overnight. So hopefully this explains where Columbus comes from. Next lecture, which again I will be uploading tomorrow, so look for it. This one I'm going to be uploading tonight, so it will be available to you tonight or early tomorrow morning. The next lecture will be about Columbus and his effect on the West. I will see you guys later, but before I leave you, I want to leave you with some questions. One of the questions is simple. How did European society change during the late Middle Ages? I want to discuss that in class. I want to talk about the transition from the feudal economy to the cash economy. What were the effects of the Black Death on this economic change and this social change? And then finally, how are events like the Black Death like the 100 Years' War, and especially the Second Great Schism, how do they affect the balance between secular power, kings and princes, versus the power of the church? I want you guys to think about that for our discussion. I will see you guys later, and have a good weekend.